Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name is Muriel and in this video I will be doing my July reading wrap up. In the month of July I read a total of 10 books, 4 books of non-fiction and 6 novels. I'll start with these 3 reference books about mythology. In the month of June, I read 2 other titles in this collection, one about Greco-Roman myths and the other about Egyptian myths. And well, in last month's reading wrap-up, I went over their major points of appeal and their drawbacks as a mythology nerd already decently versed in the topic of, well, mythology or, comparative mythology. So I'll simply do the same here with these 3. So first, there's the Japanese myths, written by Joshua Frydman. On the positive side of things, I found the book's structure based both on themes such as the creation of the world or legendary heroes, and the chronological progression of Japan's real-world history, very clear and easy to follow. Extensive information is provided about the history of Japan's several religions, and the author did a great job of explaining how different religious traditions became interwoven in Japan's culture, folklore, and thus mythology. There's also a lot of data about the origin and evolution of various gods, spirits, and religious practices, which was, for me, a huge plus. On the more negative side of things, I thought more page time could have been allotted to Shinto supernatural folklore specifically. Think yokai and company. Additionally, the yokai kami distinction, if there actually is one as such, could have been made clearer, honestly. I would have also appreciated an extra paragraph or 2 about the Ainu, or, just the different ethnic groups of Japan more broadly, and how each has or might have contributed to the country's mythological history, as it were. Overall, however, the positives far outweigh the negatives, and I learned a lot here about not only Japanese mythology and folklore, but Japanese religion, culture, and real-world history. The book also concludes on a fascinating and kind of fun note about the continuing living mythology, as it were, of Japan, and how things like kaiju and mechs participate in that tradition. So I rated this one with an 8 to a soft 8.5 out of 10. Then I read the Norse myths written by Carolyne, Larrington. On the positive side, I appreciated the author's very smooth and clear delivery of the material, and the fact its presentation was not Viking exclusive in the sense that the author doesn't only reference or take into account things like the Icelandic Eddas, but also textual and archaeological evidence from broader pre-Christian Scandinavian and Germanic cultures. The book features stories about gods and heroes, both, some of which I'd never encountered before, so big plus there, and lots of relevant information about related Norse culture and theology. Interesting tidbits of commentary about the meaning or etiology of this or that aspect of Norse mythology were also provided by the author. On the more negative side, I would have enjoyed a bit more information about this or that deity, assuming it exists, and additional information about specifically female supernatural entities more generally, such as the Norns, which I really expected more to be said about, quite frankly. And even though this book was not Viking exclusive, like I already said, in its discussion of Norse mythology, I would have, yes, liked even more page time allotted to, well, for instance, Anglo-Saxon and just broader Germanic pagan religion, as far as the archaeological record allows, of course. Still, all in all, this was another very good reference I rated with an 8.5 out of 10. And finally, there's the Celtic myths, written by Miranda Aldhouse-Green. And I actually remembered I've read another book written by this author dedicated to the Druids specifically that I also thoroughly enjoyed, so you go. But as to this book, on the positive side of things, once again, I enjoyed the book's comprehensive and thematic approach to the material, and the fact the author took the time in her introduction to give a clear explanation of what is meant by Celtic mythology and culture. The book not only features the mythic stories of Ireland and Wales that were written down by Christian monks during the Middle Ages, but also draws parallels between them and material archaeological evidence from both what used to be Gaul, so, Western Europe, broadly speaking, and the British Isles. A lot of information was also provided here about various elements of pan-Celtic culture, folklore, and theology, with interesting tidbits of interpretative commentary thrown in here and there as well. On the more negative side of things, finally, the thematic structuring of the material and the author's focus on drawing parallels between Welsh and Irish myth cycles specifically, both mean less time was spent on actually telling complete singular narratives, which I did want at times. Since commentary was offered, I would have also appreciated greater focus on the intermingling of gender dynamics in culture and myth/religion, as far as the available data actually allows. Of course, I would have also enjoyed greater focus on actual deities and supernatural entities, and even more speculation drawing from the Gaulish archaeological record, once again as far as the available data actually allows. But overall, I think this book is another very good reference, and I accordingly rated it with a solid 8 out of 10. So this basically means I would happily and confidently recommend all of the 5 books I've now read in this collection to beginner and intermediate mythology enthusiasts alike. After that little trio, I read The Witch's Garden, written by Sandra Lawrence. This is basically the botanical counterweight of the author's other book, The Magic of Mushrooms, which I read last year, and thus a nice and very colourful publication about plants, this time in culture and folklore. This book is divided in different thematic chapters, such as plants for healing, witchy plants, makes sense given the title, plants for different phases of life, etc., etc. And it presents both general information about botany, or rather ethnobotany as a whole, and then more precise information about different species of mostly vascular plants. So in practice, this means that you have a general section that goes with the theme of the chapter, like this, plants of the ancient world, and then it goes into specific species and the folklore attached to, that species or, that family of plants. Here you have mints and things like that. Now, I would have appreciated a little more pure botany, like I would have appreciated a bit more pure mycology with The Magic of Mushrooms. I was a little disappointed a couple of personal favourite plants were absent from the book, and I'm pretty sure I spotted 1 or 2 mistakes in the text, maybe? But the book otherwise contains what is advertised in the title, with lots of beautiful older illustrations to boot. I rated this one with a 7.5 out of 10. I'm going to assume that's what I rated The Magic of Mushrooms with as well. And yeah, I would argue it's a solidly enjoyable publication for botany and ethno-botany aficionados alike, just as The Magic of Mushrooms is a book I would recommend to both mycology and ethno-mycology aficionados alike. Basically get both is what I'm trying to say here. Moving on to the fiction now. First, last month, I read The God of Small Things, written by Arundhati Roy. This is a novel I read because of a friend, and it features a kind of story I wouldn't ordinarily gravitate towards, that of a tragedy-stricken family, primarily perceived through the eyes of its youngest members, a pair of dizygotic male and female twins named Rahel and Esther. Now, this story doesn't have the most straightforward narrative structure, as it tends to split into tangents that aren't immediately related to its main narrative through line. This isn't something I generally enjoy, but I've also seen worse, too much worse, in terms of experimental structuring, shall we say, so I can't say this was too bothersome either. The prose, for its part, gets a bit fancy, as I suppose Booker Prize winners are wont to do. Overwrought, affected a tad, etc. are other adjectives that come to mind. A lot of words that shouldn't be are capitalized, entire paragraphs are repeated in a way reminiscent of poetry, which I both liked and found annoying. Nouns and adjectives are too often, for my taste, squished together for no reason that I could see. This thing here was mossy green. That thing there was steel sharp. etc. because reasons. Thankfully though, discussing this book with my friend allowed me to realize some, at least, of these stylistic idiosyncrasies can be seen as perception building or perception framing devices, reflecting Rahel and Esther, so the protagonist of the story, or I mean, Rahel really is the main protagonist, I suppose, but their childhood perceptions. Indeed, most of them crop up in the story's past sections, as opposed to its present time ones centered on an adult Rahel. So it makes more sense to me for words or concepts to be capitalized, for instance, if I'm meant to see them through a child's mind's eye, and so this allowed me to tolerate the author's stylistic choices a lot more than I would have otherwise, because on their own, yes, they did bug me just a smidge, and fun fact, my mother has also read this novel, and she had a way bigger issue with that than I actually did. Now, prose or writing style does not sit at the top of my personal hierarchy of literary needs, if you will. So it's not like this was a deal breaker for me either, but given this novel has received a lot of praise for its beautiful writing style, specifically, I wanted to point this stuff out because this is certainly not what I specifically appreciated about it. So there is a plot, yes. Tragedies strike this family in Kerala, in India, and the story unfolds around these two twins, and then the adult female twin in the present, and the story structure, like I said, is rather meandering or tangents-oriented. However, it does ultimately spiral around and towards a central family tragedy or rather set of tragic events. This also means the story is more concerned with familial character work than it is with individual character work, if that makes sense. And that's fine, as the former felt well done overall, though it does bear repeating, this isn't the kind of thing I care all that much about in storytelling on its own. I'm also kind of naturally biased against stories that focus on childhood and or child characters and their experiences. I mean, at best, I can find it neutrally or detachedly interesting, and thankfully, I guess, I did so here, so that was alright. I mostly enjoyed learning about the novel's setting, so it's set in Kerala, in India, its history and culture too, and the story's theming. The god of small things, inexorable spiral is what I would call it, of familial tragedy and intergenerational trauma. Oh yes, drives forward a visceral exploration of unresolvable loss, unresolvable grief, or I mean potentially unresolvable, and the delicate, but perhaps increased value of love in the very face of life's cruel to very cruel tragedies. And I found this theming effective, moving, and it additionally reflects the novel's title very well. That's a small thing, sure, but one I nonetheless always appreciate, so a little extra bonus point there for that. The book also has a very good ending. I mean, it felt very good to me. To be clear though, in the sense that it satisfyingly fits its themes and feels right. Not in any specific emotional tonal fashion. I won't say more so as not to spoil, obviously. So, all in all, this was a mixed, but more positive than not back for me. One I am glad I took the time to read, yes, but also one I probably won't reread in the future. So I rated it with a very solid 6.5 out of 10, and I would definitely recommend it overall if it vaguely sounds like your thing. After that very serious, emotional reading experience, I read books 2 and 3 of Anne Bishop's The Black Jewels trilogy, Heir to the Shadows, and Queen of the Darkness. I read book 1, Daughter of the Blood, last year in November, I think it was, because a dear friend of mine read it as a much younger man and said I should give it a go. Probably out of cheekiness more than anything else, if I'm honest, but regardless, I had a good time with Daughter of the Blood. It was the perfect palate cleanser I needed at the time I read it, and thus figured I might as well continue with the rest of the trilogy. The Black Jewels trilogy overall basically follows a set of characters living in 3 adjacent or overlapping realms. I'm still not quite clear on the geography involved, to be honest. 2 of these realms are living realms, and then the third is essentially the underworld, the afterlife. Alright, the people of these realms are essentially divided into 2 big categories: regular humans and non-human animals on the one side, and magic folks and non-human animals on the other. There are also different races, kind of humans and humanoids, one of which is called the Aryan. They have wings sprouting from their backs, because why not? And then there are different castes of magic users within the group of magic folk. You have seers, healers, stuff, and then a magic system that is both tied to sex. The females are the more powerful magic users, but don't think this is anything even remotely resembling the Wheel of Time, though. And then it's also channeled through gemstones you get when you're born, so you get a set of gemstones. It's like a color-coded system too, but then you can upgrade your gemstones once you come of age based on your magic potential, I guess, your strength and stuff. Ultimately though, you never really get solid background information on any of this. Lack of world building bugged me a tad in book 1, but and you know what, I'm happy to say this actually improves somewhat in book 2 specifically, especially given the dragon was involved, so I'm always going to be a fan of that. But I mean, I mostly stayed on for the vibes, really. The plot, for its part, revolves around basically a long-awaited chosen one, a female chosen one, so cool, called Witch with a capital W, yay. And then there are gendered power dynamics that are played around with somewhat in this series, and you know what? It could have been very cringe, and it wasn't really. So I was mildly but happily surprised though, actually. The characters were sufficiently endearing, I guess, to this non-character-driven reader, though I am a bit disappointed the central chosen one figure never had her own point of view, because like you have different points of view in the series, but she never had a point of view chapter that I can recall, and I suppose this was by design, sure, since she's kind of meant to be a sort of almost mythical figure, so you need some distance from that, but ultimately, I don't think this was the best call to make, but you make of that what you will. I certainly liked the gradual addition of magical non-human animals, wolves, spiders, cool, but, you know, not as cool as the Adrian Tchaikovsky spiders, unicorns, and horses. You got magic-wielding unicorns, that's kind of cool, I've never seen that before, so kudos for that. And you know what, I never tired of the witchy spiderwebs and stuff, and mildly edgy in the non-cringe way, I guess, imagery. That was just fun to me. And I'll even give a point to the author. The way she handled sexual violence and trauma in her story, because it's a fair bit of that, nothing too explicit, but like the way it's handled was actually satisfying to me. So a point for that, unlike any number of other authors. Now, this trilogy remained fantasy romance throughout. I thought more sex might come in books 2 and 3, but not really. It never actually became erotica in any real sense. And yes, there are a couple of questionable aspects to the story, especially in book 1. What you gonna do? And kind of tied into the gendered power dynamics and the steamy romance, but at the same time, not that badly either. I guess my expectations are so low now with this stuff, I'm sure it would bother a lot of other readers, but I was like, you know what, this was actually not that bad. Still, this trilogy wasn't anything to really write home about. Outside of its vibes, aesthetics, you know, the witchy, spidery, bloody, mildly edgy stuff. But honestly, I enjoyed that stuff well enough, and just, yeah, I had fun with this series overall. I'm not going to minimize that, so you know what, I guess I'm gonna rate the lot of it with a very positively felt 6 out of 10. Well done. From somewhat steamy fantasy romance, I moved on to actual fantasy erotica with The Rose, written by Tiffany Reisz. This is a novel I got wind of through another booktube channel a while ago, actually, and I decided to give it a go because A, it's been a hot minute, or two since I dabbled with erotica, and you know what, I wanted to see what was being done these days in the genre, broadly speaking, outside of the meme erotica realm a la Ice Planet Barbarians. That was still a fun experience though. And B, because the premise sounded kind of neat, I guess. It being that the main female character, whose name I can't quite recall at the minute because why would I, receives a magical ancient Greek chalice for her birthday, as one does. And said chalice gets her entangled with a mysterious dude named August, who tells her the chalice can make any fantasy come alive. Now, both of them enjoy the Greek myths for very different reasons, and thus the book features Greek mythology-inspired sexual fantasies. Why not? But honestly, I did not like this. Wow. Now, some of the sexual writing, keeping in mind that especially with this stuff, it's going to highly depend on personal preferences. Some of that was, for me, competent and effective enough. Sure, yes, okay, fine. But there was also just a lot of painful cringe. Just painful cringe with the characters, the sex itself, sometimes the situation, or in the broader plot. Ugh. Speaking of the characters, I absolutely hated the protagonist. August, for one thing, was, I mean, he wasn't that bad, but he read basically as a smug bastard. His attempts at humor were cringe. Leah, that was her name, is this spoiled rich kid daughter of a bunch of kinky English nobles, whoopie freaking do, who decides to start an escort agencies with her besties because she thinks it's fun or whatever, and like, just fuck off. With that to start with. Look, I'm sorry, that's just a me thing, but I'm just not about prostitution like this. Nope. I was not about some of the cringy commentary, sort of. Nope. Or the uber cringe insta-love, BS in this thing either. And then, I mean, this didn't happen too often, thankfully, but like some of the vocabulary used to describe the sex was just a fat nope for me too. Like, for instance, without going into details because that would be awkward, like using the word boy in an NSFW description, like describing a man and then saying his, well, this body part is that of a man, that one is of a god, and that one is of a boy, all in the same sentence, in a sexual context? Ew! I'm sorry, again, maybe that's a me thing, but any mention of anything even remotely related to childhood in a sexual context is just the fattest of nopes for me. So that's that. And it's really disappointing too because some of that erotic writing was actually quite good in places, but then it was contrasted to this just painful cringe. And so, sad to say, the decent-ish mythology-inspired sex scenes were not enough to compensate for that. So this turned out to be a very disappointing and mediocre 5 out of 10 for me, and I would not particularly recommend this book to people looking for fantasy erotica, I guess. Not that I'm that well versed in that subgenre either. And also, this stuff, like I said, is just so deeply idiosyncratic. So in this specific instance, you extra make of that what you will. And then in the last 10 or so days of June, I started and made some good headway into Octavia E. Butler's Xenogenesis trilogy, with Dawn and most of Adulthood Rites. Now, I'm enjoying this series so far. Or, I mean, the premise is pretty horrific. So what I'm enjoying is the theming here. Because yes, this is yet again, at least with these two so far, proper ideas-driven SFF, and I always love to see it. But otherwise, yeah, it's fairly gut-churningly rough going in places, given the trilogy's premise, the short of which is rapey aliens go brrrr. And I won't say more than that because I will eventually do a series review for this trilogy, so I'll give you a proper premise then. Thematically, there are obvious parallels drawn here between what the Oankali, the aliens of the story, do to the humans of the story and human beings, exploitation of non-human animals and one another through slavery, all that fun stuff. But I personally contend parallels can also be drawn between what the Oankali do to human beings and what predators specifically do to their victims through grooming and attendant rape. Because rapey aliens go brr. Now, I'll also add I have some issues with the world building as it currently stands, 2/3 of the way through the series, mostly regarding the Oankali's biology and ideology, kind of. But we'll see how that pans out, or doesn't, by the time I'm fully done with the story. I did rate Dawn with a tentative 7 out of 10, but I will reserve my true full rating, as it were, for the entire trilogy. And, well, like I said, since I plan on reviewing it as well, in hopefully not too long of a while, I'll leave it at that for now. I'll now go through some of the stuff I watched last month, because this is apparently becoming a recurring segment. So first, I watched Ghost in the Shell Innocence, a sequel of sorts to the Ghost in the Shell movie I watched in May, and I preferred it to the latter. I quite enjoyed it, in fact. You can definitely tell there's a difference in, well, maybe not art style as such, but art technology, I guess? Whatever it is, I prefer this movie's overall visual signature over that of its predecessor. Although, this Ghost in the Shell clearly features CGI, and at times you can really tell it's CGI because it just doesn't really blend all that well with the drawn animation surrounding it. Otherwise, all the issues I had with the first movie were essentially resolved in this one. The pacing was better, the character work was somewhat better, and most importantly for me, the theming was infinitely better delivered. Thank goodness. But I was a little disappointed Motoko Kusanagi doesn't quite appear in this movie. I found her intriguing enough in the first one that it would have been nice to get additional character work for her in Innocence. Though she's not completely absent from it either, but I can't say more without spoiling. There was also an adorable and adorably drawn dog in this anime, so that gets an automatic point from me. And, well, if I had to slap a rating on this one, I'd give it a solid 7 out of 10. Now, it's all going to be TV, well, not entirely, but mostly television. You'll see what I mean. Last month, I finished watching the TV adaptation of Conversations with Friends. Convos with Friends. And it was good. It's a pretty faithful adaptation overall, honestly, so if you like the novel, I'd say watch the show. I suppose the book does go deeper into, character motivations and emotional processing, perhaps, as it kind of usually goes, with book to movie telly adaptations, but also I basically felt the feels I did when I read the source material, shed some or a lot of tears, and yes, I'm gonna say this, found the sex scenes well done. However, given the aforementioned feels and tears, I am now more determined than ever not to touch the Normal People adaptation with a 10-foot pole for the next 10 years. So that's that. I also finally finished the TV adaptation of His Dark Materials, which I started whenever the first season came out, but then, failed to keep up with, as has been my MO for the last however many years. So I binge-watched seasons 2 and 3, and it's honestly a really good adaptation, in my opinion. For one thing, James McAvoy and Ruth Wilson were absolutely perfect as Lord Asriel and Mrs. Coulter, and for another, I think the show handled the latter as a character way better than the books do. The screenwriters gave Mrs. Coulter much needed additional character depth, and so I felt I understood her and some of her actions a lot more than I ever did reading the source material. I also feel Lyra was somewhat better handled as a character in the show, especially in relation to Will, because I had issues with that in the books. I would have liked to see more demon action, because of course, but what you get in the show is still very good and endearing. But, you know, demons are like the best thing about his dark rituals for me, so I'm definitely biased. Ditto with the witches. Conversely, I think the pacing of the Mary Malone with the Mulefa subplot was handled worse in the show than it is in the Amber Spyglass. It basically felt even more pointless to me. Also, sue me, but they done fucked up the Mulefa, and I was big mad about that. Don't at me with CGI budget constraints. I don't care. They should have been infinitely cooler on screen than they were, period. Like, the Mulefa are a properly interesting, original, creative creature design. I've wanted to see book-accurate Mulefa brought to life on a screen for years, and they done fucked that up. I also still cringed hard at, even hated, what I cringed hard at and hated in the source material, i.e. the whole Eve 2.0, Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, and Teenage Love Saves the Multiverse shtick. But I'll concede I was actually moved by the way the show brought to life, illustrated some of that, and the overarching story's resolution. So kudos to the showrunners. And finally, the way what I interpret as the story's pantheistic motif was visually brought to life. So basically the dust and afterlife stuff. Also, I'm not kidding here, had me shedding fucking rivers of tears. So once again, kudos, because that was freaking beautiful. So I would definitely wholeheartedly recommend this adaptation, both to fans and just, you know, solid appreciators of the original trilogy, because I didn't enjoy the trilogy as much as I did the first time I read it as a teenager. So I read it as an adult a few years ago. I didn't like it as much, but it still has a special place in my heart. So fans and solid appreciators alike, yes, watch it. At any rate, it was certainly well worth it for me. And then, in July, I watched Neon Genesis freaking Evangelion and End of Evangelion. The NGE stuff available on Netflix, basically, because yes, I'm aware there are rebuild series out there, big freaking whoop. And yes, you might have guessed by my tone there that this so did not work for me for a few different reasons, which I'll probably delve into a dedicated video review. So the thing is here, I watched Neon Genesis Evangelion because technically three people recommended it to me, the first of whom was my ex David back in 2021. And the funny thing about this is he encouraged me to review it because of my interest in thematically rich SFF, so you know what? Guess I'm gonna do exactly that, and it's kind of hilarious that I'm going to be quite salty about it, as it so happens. But until then, and again, you know, mini warning, salt about to drop here. So the short of it is, Neon Genesis Evangelion is like this cult status anime legions of fanbros claim is a masterpiece, or audience say it with me, work of genius trademark. You know the drill here, that supposedly subverts the mecha subgenre, mechs being giant death robots, of course. Now, I am not a weeb. My knowledge of anime tropes and subgenres remains limited, but mechs and kaiju aren't a new thing to me either, and if I had to choose between the two, I'd go with the latter over the former because, quite frankly, I feel entirely indifferent towards ginormous death machines. So I went into Neon Genesis Evangelion for the world building and themes specifically, which my ex had told me would be rich and richly filled with esoteric references, symbolism, what have you, and I was big frustrated, not to say nerdily blueballed, on the intellectual snacking front, which pissed me off. Because I also binged this bitch over like 24 hours or something, so I had a massive headache afterwards. And it's not like there's nothing in terms of theming in this anime, but there is a crap ton of cringe, oof, and Freudian BS I just couldn't with. And Neon Genesis Evangelion is the kind of story that likes to go, oh wait, you actually thought all of this would eventually come together and make sense? Fuck you. I was very, very strongly reminded of the Book of the New Sun watching Neon Genesis Evangelion, which, I mean, already says a lot here. Still, I didn't think it was trash either. I'm exaggerating a wee bit here. It wasn't a complete waste of 24 hours of my life, but I'll go into more detail, yes, in a future video, because you know what? Catharsis and shit. So stay tuned for that if you want, keeping in mind, I've never reviewed an anime show before, so that's just gonna be a trip, I guess, if nothing else. With all that being said, I hope you had a good reading and everything else month of July, and on that note, I hope you'll have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Do take good care of yourselves. Thank you for continued support, and I shall see you all, hopefully, reasonably soon in the next video, which will probably be a review. But until then, bye-bye.